My name is Beverly Parayno, and I'm a writer based out in Oakland, California. I lived in Cork from, 2002 to 2003. I did a master's in Irish literature at University College Cork, during which time I interned or volunteered for the Munster Literature Center and got to meet and become really good friends with a lot of the local poets and writers like Pat Cotter, who is the director of the MLC. Of course, Jerry Murphy back then. Some of you might remember Greg O'Donoghue, who has passed, and Hattie Galvin. So I'm sure a lot of you on here know them. So I was in Cork during a wonderful time and try to be a part of the Cork Festival every year in some way. So thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to talk with Lysley Tenorio and Irenosen Okojie today. And I just realized, maybe James, you can help me out here, but I just realized I don't have their bios in front of me. Would you be able to read them?
Okay, so I will start with Irenosen. So Irenosen Okojie's work has been featured in the New York Times, The Observer, The Guardian, the BBC, and the Huffington Post, amongst other publications. Her short stories have been published internationally. She was presented at the London Short Story Festival by Ben Okri as a dynamic writing talent to watch, and was featured in the Evening Standard magazine as one of London's exciting new authors. Her debut novel, Butterfly Fish, published by Jacaranda Books, won a Betty Trask Award and was shortlisted for the Edinburgh First Book Award. Her short story collection, Speak Gigantular, was shortlisted for the Edgehill Short Story Prize, the Jhalak Prize, the Saboteur Awards, and nominated for a Shirley Jackson Award. Her next two books, Nudibranch and Curandera, have been signed by Little Brown's Dialogue Books. Irenosen is the winner of the 2020 AKO Caine Prize for Fiction for her story, Grace Jones. And Lysley Tenorio is the author of the novel The Son of Good Fortune and the short story collection Monstrous, which was named a Book of the Year by the San Francisco Chronicle. He is a recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Whitling Award, a Stegner Fellowship, the Edmund White Award, and the Rome Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, as well as residencies from the MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, and the Bogliasco Foundation. His stories have appeared in The Atlantic, Zoetrope, All Story, and Plowshares, and have been adapted for the stage by the American Conservatory Theatre in San Francisco and the Mayi Theatre in New York City. Born in the Philippines, he lives in San Francisco and is a professor at St. Mary's College of California.
Thank you, James. So to start off the program, Lysley and Irenosen will read from their works, and then we will have a discussion following the readings. So let's see. Lysley, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know these are really strange times throughout the world, so I appreciate you making the time, and I hope this conversation is a good distraction from all the challenges in life. It's really wonderful to be back at the festival, even if it's virtual. I was there in 2012 and fell in love with Cork in Dublin, and wish it could be in person, but I'm hoping to go back soon. I'm going to read, so this is a short story festival, but I'm going to read from my novel, which is called The Son of Good Fortune. My book of stories, which came out in 2012, is called Monstrous. But the prologue of my novel was published as a short story, so I'm hoping that it sounds like a short story. And it was originally published in this really wonderful literary magazine called Zizova, which is based out of San Francisco. And just a little background on the novel. It is the story of a young Filipino man who's 19 years old named Excel, and his Filipino mother named Maxima. Both are undocumented and living in Northern California and just trying to make their way through the world. And I'm going to read the prologue, which focuses on Maxima, and hopefully you get a sense of what her life is like. Maxima in the dark. Half lit by a Virgin Mary nightlight and the glow of a screensaver, a slow motion sweep of stars and planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Earth. Dressed in denim cutoffs and a Mickey Mouse t-shirt, she doesn't shiver despite her wide open window and the cold night beyond. She sits at the foot of her bed, cleaning her nails with the tip of a switchblade. May bakas ka bang nakikita sa aking mukha? She sings. Like all her favorite Filipino love songs, this one is about heartbreak. An alarm goes off. The digital clock glows red, 10:10 p.m. She closes the switchblade. She stands and stretches, takes quick jabs at the air, 1, 2, 1, 2, then flips on the desk lamp and sits, turns on the ball-shaped webcam atop her monitor. A tap to the spacebar and the galaxy vanishes. Now her face fills the screen. Using it as a mirror, she puts on maroon lipstick and dabs with a Kleenex, smiles wide to check her teeth. She undoes her ponytail and shakes out her hair, a long black wave, then turns her face side to side, searching for her best angle. She could easily pass for 30, but is somewhere in her 50s. Her true age, she swears, is a mystery, even to herself. Eyes closed and fingertips on the keyboard, she whispers to herself so softly that a person standing next to her would have no hope of knowing what she says. She takes a deep and slow breath, opens her eyes, types and clicks until another browser window opens. There is a man on the screen. My love, he says. No, she says, in Tagalog. Sorry, he says. Hello, Mahal. That's better, she says, and blows him a kiss. Oh, Mahal, please don't tease. It's been a lousy few days. Maxima leans into the screen. Ano ba? What happened, Henry? Oh, where to start, he says. He removes his glasses, the stubbly flab of his cheeks moving up and down as he rubs his temples. He pours a shot of Jack Daniels into a coffee mug and recounts his terrible week. More layoffs at the plant and all the guys blame him. His ex-wife trashed the Miami timeshare but won't pay for repairs. And just today, an invitation to his high school reunion. My freaking 40th, he says, arrived in the mail. But the real downer, he says, is the weather. End of spring and I'm still shoveling snow. Snow, snow, snowy, snowy snow, Maxima sings in a made-up tune. She puts her elbows on her desk, rests her chin on her hands. My whole life, I have never seen snow. Come to America, Henry says. Come to North Dakota. One day, she says, if God is good. God is always good, he says. Come closer to the screen. I want your face to fill it. She leans into the webcam, so close that she could kiss it. Henry says she is the most beautiful woman he has ever seen. These past 3 weeks of talking online, he says, are the best he's had in years. A twice-divorced, balding white guy on the edge of 60 doesn't hope for much. But when he found her profile on goodcatholicfilipinas.com and saw that her favorite food was sweet and sour chicken, that her favorite singer was Shania Twain, and that her lifelong dream was to live in joy with a good man in God's country, he convinced himself to send her a message. I know it's silly to reminisce, he says, but life before you seems so long ago. I didn't realize how lonely I was. I was lonely too, she says. And I think, he says, that maybe, well, probably that I might be falling in love with you. She pulls away from the screen. I'm sorry, he says. Too much, too soon? She shakes her head. Not too soon, Mahal. I think maybe I'm falling in love with you too. With me? She laughs. Yes, with you, tanga. Tanga, he says. It means stupid. Soon, she says, you'll speak Tagalog, and then you can visit me in the Philippines, diba? He leans into his webcam. His whole head seems to inflate on Maxima's screen. When can we meet, he says. Philippines to America, she sighs. Not so easy trip. The lines in Manila for passports and visas take hours, she says, sometimes days, and never mind the near zero chances of government approval. Their best hope for being together is to pray, to keep faith in God, and to wait. And when I come to North Dakota, she says, will you show me the snow? Count on it, he says. Okay, she says, but one condition only. I don't shovel. He laughs, which makes her laugh, harder and harder until she's hunched over, her laughter becoming gasps for air. Mahal, Henry says, are you okay? She shakes her head, takes a breath, and says it's nothing, then keels over again. It's definitely not nothing, he says. What's wrong? She looks straight at the camera. I'm hurt. Hurt? Hurt where? She clears her throat and takes a breath. Don't worry, Henry, it's nothing, okay? Stop saying that. Just tell me what's wrong. She looks at him for a moment as though wondering if he can be trusted with something as private as pain. If that's what you want, Mahal, she stands up, then okay. She lifts her shirt slowly, adjusting the camera to make sure he sees, then turns in a slow circle to reveal a wound, a crusty gash that spans from the top of her hip to the middle of her abdomen. She explains, it happened in the typhoon 2 months before. A snap of bamboo, sharp as a spear, sliced across her body in high-velocity winds. I lost so much blood, she says, but I'm thinking, okay lang, it's just a cut, bahala na, pero now I have an infection. Her own grandmother, she tells him, died from an infected wound, but God's good grace will keep her alive, she's sure of it. She lowers her shirt and sits, but every day, she says, it hurts. What can I do, Henry says, how can I help? Oh, I hate this, I hate being so far away from you. Before Maxima can speak, he says that maybe the day to meet should come sooner than later. What if this is God and the universe telling them that he should be the one to fly to her, and depending on the current round-trip airfare from Grand Forks to Manila, now is the time to come together? But Maxima says no. For now, all she needs are his love, faith, and prayers, nothing else. But there's one thing, she says. Tell me, Henry says. Medicine, ointments and creams with all of the antibiotics. The best hospital in Manila has them, pero walang pera. Walang pera, he says. No money. There's never any money, she says. Well, Henry says, how much do you need? Bahala na mahal, it's okay, please don't worry. How much? Tell me. No, I can't accept. She swivels her chair away from the screen. I'm too ashamed. Just tell me, he says, please. She takes a deep breath. 22,000 pesos. Pesos, how much is that? $400 USD. Henry says nothing, just listens. Half the money's for the doctor, she says. The other half is for the medicine. In the Philippines, if you have no insurance, medical care is very expensive. It's almost impossible talaga. It's not like in the States. She dabs her eyes with her pinky and, with her other hand, safely out of camera view, she reaches for the switchblade next to her computer. She flicks it open and twirls it between her fingers, a thing she does when anxious or uncertain, when the inevitable is on the edge of finally happening. On screen, Henry is motionless, his face a blank. Mahal, she says, are you there? Finally, Henry moves. I'm here, he says, sorry. The screen froze for a sec. Where were we? What were you saying? Money, she says, for the medicine. And how much was it? 500? 500, she says, yes, 500 USD. He looks toward the ceiling and blinks like he's adding up figures in his head. Let's make it 600, okay? 600? She shakes her head, says no, 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 and starts to weep. It's too much, Mahal, it's too much. Shh, he says, a finger to his lips. There's no price on love, diba? She wipes her eyes with the Kleenex, says it's almost 1 p.m. in the Philippines, time for her to go. She gives quick instructions when and how he can wire money to an online account, and she tells him that she'll let him know when the payment goes through. This will help me so, so much, Henry. Thank you, Mahal, thank you, she says. And soon, one day, I promise, we will meet. Henry nods. Yes, Mahal. And when we do, we'll sit in the countryside, put on some Shania Twain, and then he leans into his camera, filling her screen again. We're gonna fuck like bunnies. He winks and kisses the air, and the blade spins faster in Maxima's hand. They say goodbye, and Henry signs off, disappears from the screen. But Maxima is still there, and for a moment, she watches herself, tilts her head slightly, like her face is one she recognizes but doesn't quite know. She turns off the webcam. She lifts her shirt and carefully peels away the wound, a trick of rubber and glue, then jots down quick notes in a small spiral notebook. She picks up the switchblade and opens her closet, where, on the inside of the door, she has tacked up a human target, the kind you find at a shooting range. She steps back, stands against the opposite wall. She raises the blade, aims, and throws. She misses the heart, but not by much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lysley. Such a powerful opening to the novel. Thanks for reading that excerpt. So next, Irenosen, are you ready to share some of your work with us?
Yeah, happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's my first time at the Cork International Short Story Festival. It's a festival that I've actually kept my eye on for years, so I'm thrilled to be here. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening as well. So I'm going to read from my collection of short stories, Nudibranch, which is a collection of, I would say, weird, fantastical modern day fables about characters on the cusp of change. In this particular story, Mangata, an albino man, returns home to Mozambique following the death of his mother. I'm going to read an excerpt from this. The man who brought a miracle to the small town in northern Mozambique was both remarkable and ordinary. As an albino, he wasn't an unfamiliar sight, although other things indicated he was different. He walked with a certain comfort in his skin that wasn't of the surroundings, assured, confident. He had a birthmark on his neck, which looked like a stem growing from his movements. His nails were painted black, his hands elegant, the fingers long, tapered. His tongue sported a silver ring at the tip, a pink-pierced entity darting out readily to abandon his mouth. On the afternoon Terry Midas arrived, it was scorching. He stood waiting at the pickup point near the market, a black god painted alabaster holding his light travel bag. His batik shirt had sweat patches, tan trousers stuck to his clammy thighs uncomfortably. The dust-covered leather sandals he wore felt heavy, he having walked a few miles in the bush to get to this point. He'd done so with trepidation, fear scattering wildfire into his veins as it spread through his limbs. He knew the stories of albinos being persecuted, hunted for the value of their body parts, kidnapped, killed, and sold. During the war, in his mind's eye, he'd seen flashes of cutlasses raised up, bones on the necks of men whispering in the voices of ancestors, the cries of medicine men splintered in his ears. He'd seen blood in the sky and the trees shedding pale skin. He'd arrived at the market gratefully, spat from the tortuous bush, out of breath. 10 years away and nothing had prepared him for the intensity of being back. The heat, the dusty roads, the shanty houses made quaint by the distance of separation. The slick black bodies rhapsodic in their freedom. He hadn't been primed for the warmth, small burst of joy, the fear, the feeling of familiarity, the feeling of being foreign, a mouthful of echoes slipping teasingly out of reach. Sweating profusely, he stood, walked to a shaded corner of the shop he decided to wait at, thinking of albinos that had appeared to him through night traffic, hundreds of them, each holding angles of light doubling as rabbit holes. It came to him then, the memory of that night years ago, the thick suffocating heat, sluggish grasshoppers chorusing, mosquitoes hovering around the one stubby shrinking candle in their shack as if drawn to a possible death. Mama Carlos sat snoozing gently by the door to protect him in a ritual that saw her bloodshot eyes close reluctantly, eventually succumbing to the demands of her body, her large bosom rising steadily up and down. The small picture of Christ pinned on the wall above the green mosquito net which swooped down, tiny winged fireflies with far too much gumption zigzagging above their heads, and Christ's robes singed from the blue candle flame that thought it could fly, bending willfully in the heat, his eyes temporarily blinded by tiny bloodshot figures taking residence there. Terry on the bed, tossing and turning, the sound of water in the empty petrol can on the floor by his pillow of bunched clothes. Then 3 men kicked down their door. He saw the glint of blades at Mama Carlos's throat, heard rough, urgent orders being issued, Mama Carlos screaming so loudly their response was a backhand slap to her face. Terry shrank back against the wall, powerless, pale and trembling. Necklaces of small bones on the men's necks jangled, their faces partially obscured by handkerchiefs tied over their mouths. The smell of the day's sweat from their bodies mingled with fear in the room was potent. They dragged him to the rusted white truck outside, dumped him in the back, then piled in laughing, the truck screeching away, exhaust pipe smoke curling around the edges of an abduction. They sped off. The truck eventually wound its way around the bush. It was at this point Terry leaps out, running for his life. He ran so fast blindly, an alabaster boy slipped from the world's pocket into the night's cruel playground. He ignored the scratches of wild plants on his legs, the stinging on his arms. The men had left the truck, whistling crudely, clicking their fingers to catch him again. A path snaked through the bush, appearing from nowhere, glimmering, rising, rushing, similar to the noise made in their petrol can at home. He ran along the path. He never remembered how he got all the way back to the village. He'd cried in relief at the people gathered, holding kerosene lamps, babbling at them frantically, half out of his mind and skin, and everything being in the wrong place. Their shack uprooted from Mama Carlos's injuries, the girl who'd given him a green banana earlier in the day balancing a basket of bones instead on her head, clicking her fingers, crisis photo tearing through the root of the truck, his face covered with a soiled handkerchief, Mama Carlos screaming into the petrol can, the candle flame growing into a blue-tongued carcass in the bush, and the lines of the night reduced into the shape of a howl beneath tires crunching on stones. Terry pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it and took a drag. Get a hold of yourself, he thought. 6 years in New York, followed by 4 in London, working for one of the best architectural firms, had cemented his desire to build houses that were unusual living experiences. A mountain lodge in Shanghai, homes in the Arctic, communal buildings in Abu Dhabi, eco-lodges in the untamed Madagascar forest. His experiences of extreme weather, ice and heat confirmed just how tiny humans are, at the mercy of the elements, the unexpected. He knew those feelings of fear and anxiety. He'd run from them only to find they had taken roots in him anyway. Once he dated a fire eater from Guinea-Bissau, whose skin he imagined tasted of flammable liquids, whose pliable mouth parted pleasurably, walking barefoot through compact tracts of fire in her garden. Their mutual dysfunction had worked for a while, until one day he saw her in her bedroom doorway, head engulfed in flames, holding a familiar petrol can. The bedroom transformed into a bush that couldn't be contained, shooting rapidly towards the ceiling till he couldn't breathe. There were small lit creatures wailing, leaping from her firehead through the window to change guises in a distant Mozambican night. Terry took another pull from the cigarette. His desire to build had brought him home, this time for a smaller project, water fountains in the town and village. The years had passed, but he hadn't forgotten that for albinos like him, the simple, natural, instinctive act of seeking water could kill you. 4 years ago, Mama Carlos had died in her sleep of natural causes. The medicine men said her luck had run out. If albinos were hunted for the good fortune they were meant to bring, her one major contribution to the Midas family lineage, birthing an albino son, had brought her nothing but heartache and devastation. Nobody knew who Terry's father was. Margarita Carlos was a stout, large-bosomed woman of average looks. She possessed a bawdy rumble of laughter that got into your system, a certain mischief, a curiosity in her gaze beyond the simple woman she appeared to be. She was a street vendor who sold bean cakes, stewed handfuls of delicious spicy rice wrapped in parcels of broad leaves, caramelized sweets the shape of umbrellas. 31 years ago, after an evening of selling on one of the main roads, she returned to the village temporarily blind. The light in her eyes had shattered into something distant. She babbled to the other villagers about an immaculate conception, the virgin blood running down her thighs watered grateful patches of weathered ground. Her flowery white blouse was torn, a large bruise on her neck reddening. Her wares had been left on the road, the silver tray clattered to the ground, having caught the reflection of a number of ventriloquist hands in a pale costume. Her bean cake split, then crumbled. The umbrella sweeps melted into stubs of color. Packets of rice unfolded, tiny offerings, the vehicles flying past. An occasional hungry god, a wayward shadow. Marguerite fled the roadside, cicadas crying in her eardrums. The night receded into an unruly trinity of miracle, virgin blood, and fractured light. Marguerite's sight returned when Terry was born. He'd just fallen off an oil rig in the Atlantic Ocean when he knew she was dead. He'd felt a missile pass through his chest into the water, slick like a seal caught in greasy spillage. He'd looked up at the endless stretches of sky, his head full of cloud blue silence. He could barely move. The weight of her death had cracked him. 4 years of gifts made of smoke vanishing in his pockets. 4 years of shimmering angles of water undulating in mirrors he passed. He'd had to come home. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Irenosen, it's so nice to meet you. Obviously, we're just meeting for the first time. On
Lovely
this
to meet you too.
and I'm so excited to be able to talk to you. And Leslie and I actually met, I want to say maybe a decade ago, at a reading in San Francisco. And then I had the pleasure of interviewing him for the Rumpus about his short story collection. So really excited to be in conversation with Leslie again. I just want to say congratulations to you both on your recent books. And thanks again for being here. So for the next half an hour, we're just going to have some conversation. And I wanted to start off talking about imagination. When the Munster Literature Center asked me to talk to both of you, my first question was, I wonder what the curation is behind this. I wonder why the two of them got paired. And as soon as, I was familiar with Leslie's work, and as soon as I started reading your work, Irenosen, I said, oh my God, they both just have incredible imaginations. And although your work is very different, I think that's definitely something you both have in common. So I wanted to hear from you both about imagination, but specifically, so I'll start with Leslie. Leslie, in your novel, you created a fictitious city called Hello City, which is like a makeshift town in the desert where your protagonist, Excel, escapes with his girlfriend. Irenosen, you have a story where a hungry love goddess from the sea arrives on an island full of eunuchs. And also, I wanted to add that a Guardian article about you and your collection, they actually describe reading your work as not microdosing LSD, but macro dosing. So I've never taken LSD, and it's a very long time. I've tried acid, but I had to kind of laugh at that because I think a lot of your stories are amazingly surreal. So I'll start with Leslie, but can you each talk to me about your imagination, where it comes from, how you cultivate it, how it shows up in your stories? Leslie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Irenosen, I loved that. That was, I'm floored by it, and I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed your reading. It was brilliant.
Thank you. I firmly believe that if you're going to be a writer, you need to have a particular obsession or several obsessions. I don't know how else you get to the page. I think one of my particular obsessions is the weird ways that the Philippines and America have kind of come together and clashed or maybe even in some cases almost harmonized. So as a writer, I'm constantly looking for ways that evoke those tensions, and the more unexpected or the stranger, the more fired up my imagination gets. So for example, in my collection of stories, Monstrous, I have a story about the time the Beatles went to the Philippines and were beat up by a bunch of Marcos loyalists at the Manila International Airport. So when I come across a situation like that, I think this weird situation of the Beatles getting beat up feeds directly into my obsession. And I feel like once I can seize upon these sort of strange but true scenarios, I can sort of infuse it with my own emotional concerns. I don't write autobiographically, but I always say that my work is emotionally autobiographical. What my characters feel are things that I have felt or people close to me have felt. But if I can find a situation from real life and take these imaginative liberties with it and turn it into a story of some sort, that really gets me to writing. So, you know, of course, I like every writer, I rely on my imagination, but I also rely on the real world and real history. And for me, the stranger, the better.
Thanks. Irenosen?
Yeah, no, I was thinking back actually to, I guess, probably one of the first books I ever read, I think, that sparked the seed, and that was Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. And I just loved that book so much because it did this brilliant high wire act of straddling both adult and YA fiction, but it was also quite weird, and it was also fantastical because it was about this fox and his kind of adventures. And I remember being really struck by that, and I went on to read a lot more of Dahl's work, which is brilliant. So I think that sort of like sparked the seed really, and I just read voraciously. I was deeply curious child. I was always I was very sociable, but I was also always in my own head. You know, I was always trying to make sense of the world around me. And I first moved to England when I was 8 years old. I left Nigeria to come to boarding school in Norfolk, which is the kind of countryside. So it was a really sort of strange cultural transition. And I think that combined with missing home and sort of being aware of being, I don't know, a foreigner for the first time in another land, all of that kind of sparked my imagination. So I started writing quite young. So I was always like writing weird little scribblings and observations about people, writing stuff that didn't make sense, but was somehow interesting to me as well. So this combination of like prose poetry, little mini plays, but I've always been fascinated by, I guess, the human experience and the ways in which people go through things, you know, the ways in which we transition during the difficult points in our lives, and what that looks like and what that feels like psychologically. But also, I think, mapping that in new and interesting ways. I would say that I love, like Leslie, I'm really interested in the strange. You know, I love seeing the weirdness in the everyday. And sort of combining the everyday and the surreal. But I think I'm also somebody who likes to interrogate what's possible with language. I think language fascinates me. So not just the arc of a story, but the kind of, I guess, internal rhythm of it, and the interior landscapes of the characters, which I think can also be quite strange as well. So all of that, I think, the sort of in-between spaces that you can operate in writing. So like writing across genre, like not being pigeonholed by a particular framing, I think intrigues me. And I've kind of almost done that instinctively, just because I think the nature of short stories in particular means that, you know, you write one subject, you write about one experience, and then you move on, you write another experience, and it feels quite different, but there's something exciting about finishing and moving on and creating these worlds that just makes me, I guess, really invigorated by the process. I think short story writing in particular. So yeah, and I just loved the form. I think showed me a different side of myself, because I had started off with a novel. I'd written the first draft of a novel, and then I read Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son. It's one of my favorite collections, and it blew my mind. I didn't know short stories could do that, because it was this sort of molten collection about this character on the fringes, really, who was a drug addict, and you're not supposed to be invested in this person. But these were interconnected stories, and the ways in which he showed you, this character's movements and the people around him with such a lack of judgment and such empathy, but also like beautifully profound and surreal and funny. It really struck a chord with me, and I thought, wow, I wanna produce writing like that, but even weirder. So that kind of really lit a fire under my backside, should I say, in terms of like really wanting to play with the form. So I think pushing the boundaries of imagination is something that excites me hugely with writing. As you can see by the collection, like, with the goddess on the island and creating that landscape and what that feels and looks like. It's something that I think can be really, really fascinating. So yeah, that's a brilliant thing to be able to play with, I think.
We have Roald Dahl in common. I had in fourth grade, the librarian at my elementary school asked me if I could stop checking out Charlie and the Chocolate Factory so that other kids could have a chance to read it. So I returned it for 1 week, and I came back and it was still on the shelf, and I was like, can I check it out again? And so she let me do it every week after that. I have a follow-up question for you, Irenosen. Obviously, you're successful and you have a novel and 2 short story collections and all kinds of awards. But in the beginning of your career, because of your like surrealist style, and really, use of language and kind of wild imagery, did you have editors say, "What is this?"
Yeah, yeah, we got that a lot. My agent, bless her, in the beginning, she would say, "I'm really not going to make much money out of you, am I?" I said, sorry, but she said, I like your work, so I'm going to stick by you. But yeah, that was the feedback initially, and I was a little bit confused by that, because the publishing industry here would often say, in the UK, we're looking for fresh voices, we're looking for people doing something a little bit different, and here was I doing something, I think, like hugely experimental and playful. And the feedback we got was that they didn't quite know how to market me, or what to how to, I guess, make the work feel more accessible, which I found slightly frustrating, because that's your job as a publisher, certainly in the marketing department, to figure out how you do that. If you put the budget behind the author, then you can really get their voice out there. So it just seemed like they didn't really want to take a risk. They didn't really complain about the quality of the writing. They would often say, "Oh, the quality is really, really good," but we're not sure how she would fit on our list. That old adage. So yeah, we got a lot of rejections in the beginning, and then thank goodness for independent publishing houses, because that was how I got my start. Really, was through a small independent press, and they picked up both the novel and the first collection. And then when we started getting shortlisted for awards, it was really interesting. Like, half the editors that said no then contacted my agent and said, "Oh, what's she writing next?" And I was even more confused then. So I think a lot of it is about being told what to like sometimes in this industry, in a way. That they're looking for permission, rather than actually just trusting their gut instinct and trusting your own taste as an editor and as a commissioning editor, but also looking, I think, outside of the things you would normally commission. I think a really good editor thinks quite broadly in terms of what they commission. So yeah, it was frustrating, but I was so happy that it got picked up in the end. And off the back of that, I was able to get a bigger deal with a big publishing house for the next 2 books. But yeah, it wasn't an easy process.
Well, good for you for sticking with your style and not letting the industry push you into something, to be someone you're not, and to write something that is not reflective of you as a writer. So I wanted to ask Lysley, So this has to do with you being a plot-driven writer and how you came about writing this novel about an undocumented mother and son. So back in 2012, when I interviewed you for The Rumpus, you did describe yourself as a very plot-driven writer who likes to come up with stories based on real life, and especially with themes on the shared history and culture between the US and the Philippines, which you have just talked about. So is this the case with the plot of your novel? How familiar are you with the plight of undocumented Filipinos in the Bay Area or the US? And so how did you become attracted to this particular plot and this theme of the undocumented Filipinos?
Right. I should say that the novel, was a really different process. As soon as I started writing the novel, I quickly realized that the short story is no training ground for the longer form. At least, it wasn't for me. In its earliest drafts, this novel was about these sniffer dogs that were trained to sniff out pirated DVDs and became the scourge of the DVD piracy underworld. And these DVD pirates in the Philippines were trying to assassinate these sniffer dogs. So a very, very different storyline. And that was based on a true story. And I thought, I can do something with this. I wrote that whole novel and it was very messy. It was funny sometimes, but what I realized was I didn't really care. I wasn't really emotionally invested in the material. All that I was really drawn to was the relationship between this young Filipino man and his mother. And in that draft, the mother was actually deceased, so only existed in flashbacks. So I knew I needed to scrap that novel, but I knew I was drawn to this mother-son relationship. And I was especially drawn to a Filipino immigrant mother who was not only emotionally strong, but physically strong. I think a familiar trope that we see in a lot of immigrant fiction is a sort of fiercely reserved immigrant mother who internalizes everything, but is just sort of this kind of rock. I wanted an immigrant mother who could be flashy with her physicality and be physically formidable. I grew up watching Linda Carter Wonder Woman and The Bionic Woman. I love a good female action hero. And I thought, what if I have this mother-son relationship where the mother's like that and the son in comparison is kind of passive and is sort of the opposite of what his mother is. So I really had to build a whole story around this relationship. And, realizing that they would be undocumented was sort of my way of doubling down on this idea of outsiderness. As immigrants in America, particularly at this time, they're already somehow on the fringe, on the margins. Within that margin, they're outsiders even within that by being undocumented. And I just, growing up in the Filipino community as a kid in Southern California, I was close to people who were undocumented. And I saw the ways that their lives were much more complex and far richer than what we get in the news or in newspapers. And I kind of wanted to explore the complexity of that through these characters. So with the novel, it was really about building a plot around characters rather than the other way around, which is what I tend to do. So it was a completely all new process putting this book together.
Wow. So you wrote an entire novel draft that you had to scrap, but you were able to create your novel out of the characters.
Yeah,
that's a lot of work.
But it was also a horrible novel, so I'm very grateful that I scrapped it, or that I knew to scrap it. But it did take a long time to figure out the story.
Right. So I have like a kind of like personal burning question for you about the novel. So a long time ago, I dated an undocumented British guy. I was in like my early 20s. And one of the themes throughout our relationship was marriage. Like if I just married him, all of his immigration problems would go away. And I never did marry him, but it was a big issue in the relationship. And so as I was reading your novel, I was wondering I'm not sure if it was ever mentioned, like the possibility of Maxima getting married, or even Excel thinking about, hey, if I got married, I could get a job and go to school and do all these things everyone else does. did that, I don't think it came up, did it?
It's briefly mentioned. I think she suggests getting married, and he's kind of against that. He doesn't want life decisions to be determined by his need, to be for legal status. And I also did research, and for an undocumented person to marry doesn't automatically mean they can stay. It's much more complicated than that, and often they'll still have to leave, and they actually risk exposing themselves if they actually do get married. So, but I did think about it, and I realized probably not for Excel.
Yeah, and that was just a selfish question on my part because of my own personal reading of it. So,
right.
So I wanted to ask Irenosen, in several of your stories, you deal with themes of violence, including sexual violence. For example, in Nudibranch, where the protagonist eats the hearts of would-be lovers on the island of eunuchs. There's also sexual violence in the story about the Grace Jones impersonator. You write these scenes so vividly, and at the same time, almost with a little bit of a detachment, like, oh, this is totally normal in this world, right? So can you, almost as if the violence is unremarkable, even though, it has a great impact on the reader. Can you talk about your use of violence in your stories?
Yeah, sure. I guess I do it in a way that is non-judgmental towards the characters in that world, because I think that's quite important, because terrible things do happen in the real world, and I guess even within the sort of fantastical, highly imaginative milieu, I still have to ground these stories in a way. I still have to give you the processes of what these characters are going through and contextualize their lives. So it's important to do both. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is writing complicated, messy women, especially women of color and Black women, because I feel like as women, we're not allowed to really express anger or violence or revenge, or to like seethe with rage about being hard done by, and all of these are things that happen, things that happen and things that we experience. So I try to incorporate that in my fiction, because I think it's important to show that complexity, because of course women do go through these things. So for me to kind of shy away from it feels like, once again, you're being held to a different standard. Whereas if I was a man and I was writing those kind of scenes, like, it's almost like people wouldn't really blink about it. You know what I mean? But being a woman, people ask questions about it. But I love the freedom of being able to do that, as long as it's not gratuitous, and hopefully I strike a balance in terms of how I incorporate it in the writing. Then I think that it's sort of fair to do that, depending on the context of the story or what that character's been through. So, for example, in my first collection, Speak Gigantular, there's a story about a woman who finds a tiny man in her garden and begins to torture him over the course of several weeks, and they develop this really odd dysfunctional relationship. But really, it's about loss. It's a story about loss and the process of the different stages of what that looks like, which includes anger as well, which includes a certain rage, which includes a certain helplessness. So I really wanted to approach it, but come at it from a slightly different angle. So, the reader is still getting something a little bit strange, but you're going through this journey with this woman who's lost her husband, and it's almost like this tiny man is like this metaphorical figure that represents him. So yeah, I try to strike a balance when I'm doing it, but I think it's important to not shy away from violence, because of course it happens in the real world.
Yeah. Thank you. I'd love to read that story.
You have to get the first collection.
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
So Lysley, I would be remiss if I did not thank you for the humor in not only your story collection, also your novel. There's a lot of things that made me, as a Filipino American, laugh out loud. Like, for example, you have a scene in the novel where your characters, Excel, Maxima, and Joker, they bring a Tupperware container to the all-you-can-eat buffet at Sizzler, and we know why that's done. And then also, I think it's after Maxima watches her film screening of her own film, she has plans to return her dress to TJ Maxx. So there's some very, like, I think, Filipino nuances of our customs that are interwoven in the book. So I just want to thank you for those, and also just ask you kind of like, do you feel the need to explain some of these nuances? Like, I kind of wondered, would anyone else outside of the culture pick up on these? Maybe the ones I mentioned are more obvious, but did you feel the sense to explain anything? And then also, along with this question, your use of Tagalog throughout the book and your decision around using it and translating some things and not translating others.
Right. Well, thanks for pointing those moments out. I didn't really feel the need to explain that gesture of, you go to an all-you-can-eat buffet, you bring your Tupperware, you wear a dress for one night, you return it the next day. I don't imagine that's only particular to Filipinos, but to me, that certainly felt very Filipino. That's something my mother would have done. Whenever we went to a fast food restaurant, she took like a stack this high of napkins because she thinks free napkins, I just sort of have to trust that readers will go along with that, and that they'll accept that as part of that particular character's humanity. And if they recognize it in their own experience, whether or not they're an immigrant or they're Filipino, then that's wonderful. And if they don't recognize it, I hope they'll see it as a maybe funny quirk and hopefully a very human trait. So I don't really feel the need to explain the reasons for some of the things that these characters do. With using Tagalog, a lot of the time I just insert it and trust that the reader will go along with it. And also, I also have to be okay with the fact that not every single word or sentence is going to register or even necessarily be clear for some readers. And I think that's okay. When we experience life, we often encounter things that we don't understand, but we're still able to find a way to connect to those things, hopefully. If it ever does feel critical to a moment or to a scene, then I'll try to find some way to include a translation that is more of a context clue and not just this service to those who don't speak Tagalog. But for the most part, I just sort of I trust the reader. If you tell a compelling enough story and if you write something convincingly, I think most readers will go along, and and hopefully that's true with everything we write.
Yeah, thank you. Irenosen, I wanted to ask you kind of a similar question about your background. So I know you were born in Nigeria, you moved to London at the age of 8. In your work, are there nuances or things that maybe someone would not pick up on if they were not familiar with Nigerian culture?
Good question. Yeah. So in my debut novel, Butterfly Fish, which is about a troubled young woman who loses her mother but inherits an ancient Benin brass artifact. It's really about it's a multi-generational tale using this ancient artifact as a way of sort of pulling the narrative together. So it's really, I guess, about legacy for me, but within that I do write about 50s Nigeria, and I also write about the 18th century kingdom of Benin, which is a period that I was absolutely fascinated by. My father would often tell me stories about this, and I thought, wow, a lot of Black history is about slavery, but actually there are so many interesting histories that people don't really know about. So I was just really obsessed with that period in time and what it felt like. And it's interesting that I was more sort of fascinated by a past Nigeria, which is an interesting thing. And I think there was a certain freedom again in being able to write that, because I hadn't seen much of it written in fiction. I'd seen it written about in nonfiction, but not fiction. So I myself, I think, through the process of research, was discovering things about that time as well. And that was also wonderful. But I also felt like I had a shorthand about it too, having spent time, in the village with my grandmother, spent time in the remote parts of Nigeria. There's something about those areas that I think has that sort of historical lineage still very much there. So being able to write that was really wonderful. And I guess writing the section set in 50s Nigeria, I did incorporate sort of pidgin English and I guess Nigerian colloquialisms as well. But similar to Leslie, I didn't feel the need to explain that in a way. It's just in there, and you just hope that the reader, readers are very discerning, I think, and really intelligent. Even if they don't completely fully understand, they absorb it in a way that I think resonates with them. So I think they still get the overall essence of it, even if it might not be quite clear. So it was nice to be able to incorporate those elements, and I found it a really wonderful process to write about Nigeria, because having grown up in England, I felt that I was that in-betweenness that I've talked about, that I mentioned earlier. So being able to claim that cultural inheritance and then I guess translate that in the book in a way, in a sort of expansive way, was really, really lovely. And I hope that, when the reader picks it up, they pick up on those nuances, even the ones that they don't quite understand, but they get, the sort of overall feel and meaning of it in some sense.
Thank you so much. I don't know if James is on. James, are you still here? Or Pat?
Yeah.
Can I ask one more quick question, or do we have a hard stop?
No, we're okay. We can go over by a few minutes.
Okay, thank you, James. So I just want to have one final question. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom with us. I wanted to end with a question about spirituality, otherworldliness, skipping into other dimensions, crossing through space and time. So I'll start with you, Lysley. Specifically in your latest work, it's Maxima's character who has the spiritual kind of side with the prayers that she goes into. So I just wanted to ask, can you talk more about her connection to this other world and how you why and how you incorporated that into her character?
Right. Most Filipinos, as you know, Beverly, are Catholic. But it was important for me because Maxima and Excel, as I said earlier, are so much outside, the various norms that they could be part of. And I think one of those norms is the Catholic Church. So they don't identify themselves as Catholic, but Maxima does believe in a kind of higher power and a kind of divine intervention. So her spirituality actually comes from the martial arts. So I did a lot of research on Filipino martial arts, and a lot of grandmasters, that's what we might call a sensei, let's say. They have these things called oraciones, which are prayers. So and there are very fixed oraciones. There's an oracion for disarming your opponent's weapon. There's an oracion for hoping that your weapons are sharp and ready for battle. But she takes, as Maxima does, takes a lot of liberties and makes up her own orations all the time. So she has faith that there is something in the spiritual or astral world that can intervene on her behalf. But it's very selective and it's very self-serving, which I think is a spirituality that many of us possess, but also aligns with the way Maxima moves through the world. Even though her life is hard, and I hope that characters have a lot of sympathy for her, she can also be very selfish and very selective in her decisions and self-serving. So that idea of spirituality is a very particular, almost made up kind of thing for Maxima.
Right. Thank you. And Irenosen, the same question. I mean, you've got monks coming into another dimension to turn into animals in an abbey. I don't, what is that?
Yeah, so yeah, that story is pretty wild. Yeah, it's dimensional hopping monks are sort of facing a bloody reckoning in this abbey, and the abbey becomes, as I guess, this otherworldly space in a way for them, as one by one they're knocked off without giving the entire plot away. But actually, I lived in an area called Barking in East London for a bit, and there was like the ruins of an abbey near me where I lived. And I was just, every time I would walk past it, I was just fascinated by like this sort of like, yeah, I guess carcass space. And my imagination just started to kind of, run away with itself in terms of setting a story there. And I had always been intrigued by monks. I'd always been intrigued by that lifestyle and the kind of sacrifice and compromise, but also like the spiritual aspect and this idea of punishment as well. So, the seeds for the story started to kind of take root in my brain. It became clearer to me that, again, like this is this is a narrative where, nothing is kind of as it seems in a way. As you kind of read the story, you peel back the layers. But yeah, I'm interested in other dimensions and creating other dimensions, because I think it, as a really imaginative writer, it lends itself really well to the sort of brain that I have, because I can really have fun with the language and with the writing doing that. So, and also in African culture, in Nigerian culture, the sort of otherworldliness, I think, is kind of intrinsic within our stories, really, like the oral storytelling tradition. A lot of the lessons are like incorporated within stories that do have aspects of the fantastical and aspects of the spiritual and aspects of the otherworldliness. So in some ways I've kind of inherited that, I think, just from, we often carry these things in the body, I think. And I remember somebody once saying to me, did you read Gabriel Garcia Marquez a lot when you were younger? And I said, no, actually I was already writing the way I write. And I think that comes from that African oral tradition, so it's sort of in there. But of course, I love Marquez's work. His work is fantastic, but I discovered him much later. But yes, so I think that all of that, it just makes for a kind of molten ecosystem where, I can produce these highly imaginative stories set in this really fertile spaces, but again, hopefully grounding them in a way that resonates with the reader. So you're definitely going to go on a journey. You're definitely, within the stories, you're definitely going to completely go somewhere else. And, I think transformation as a theme is something that I'm really fascinated by. But I should also say that it's a process of investigation for me. I never just go to the page fully knowing exactly what's going to come out, or, plotting things down to a T. I'm a very instinctive writer, and I do that again because it allows for these lovely kernels to come through. And one day you write a scene, and then you come back the next day and the character's saying something different to you, and I kind of go with it, because I think if I'm really excited by these other dimensions, then the reader will be too. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Lovely. Thank you so much to you both. I think we're out of time. I could talk to you for so much longer, but congratulations again to both of you.
Thank you so much, Beverly. Thank you for a wonderful evening. And thank you, Leslie, too. That was great.
Thank you both.
James, do you have any closing remarks, or?
I don't. No, that was incredible. And we'll be back for the next few days as well. So we have events at 7 and 9 o'clock Irish time tomorrow, Friday and Saturday.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. And everyone stay healthy and safe.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Lovely to meet you. I'm going to get your book.
Yeah, I'm going to get your book too.
Yeah.
Great.
Wonderful. Bye, everyone.
Stay healthy.
Bye,
Stay safe.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.